Anybody here have a policy at your workplace regarding domestic violence? One? One. About 25% of U.S. companies actually have a policy that address responding to domestic violence in the workplace. Unfortunately, domestic violence is the fastest growing motive for workplace homicide. The majority of homicides committed at the workplace are domestic violence homicides. Because why? It's one of the only places that the abuser can now find a victim who has left him. So we are going to talk about 5 areas you as an employer should consider when deciding to address domestic violence in the workplace. First, what do you think the first one's going to be? No peeking on the PowerPoint slides either. It has to come from the top. If it doesn't come from the top, it's going nowhere. And I can use this as an example. We try and implement a lot of different programs in our office or with different police departments, and I have a great Amherst police officer that's all on board to do this training or this new policy with the police department, and she takes it back and tells all the officers, okay, this is what you're going to do when you respond to a domestic violence call from now on. I've brought 6,000 of these domestic violence high-risk team brochures back. I want you to think about it and refer the offender if it's appropriate. That's great that Courtney said that, but you know what? Or the officer said that. But you know what? Coworkers are not going to respond if it's not coming from anybody but the boss. Have you ever tried to implement something and it didn't come directly from the boss? Even though the boss wanted to do it, try to implement it, it goes nowhere. So it has to come from the boss. And the boss has to say 3 things, at least 3 things, but 3 important things. We're not going to let domestic violence happen here. We will respond if it does. And if it does happen here with one of our employees, whether on or off the workplace, we are here to help. The key word there is to help. Not to judge, not to tell them what to do, but we are here to help. And if these 3 things come from the boss, and there's a culture created in the workplace that it's safe to talk about domestic violence, that you're not going to be judged, you're not going to get a scarlet letter on you by your coworkers because you're a victim of domestic violence, I guarantee you that victims of domestic violence are going to come forward and ask for your help as managers, supervisors, and employers. And when it comes from the boss, we've seen this happen in a few companies. It comes out. Courtney's Tire Company, with over 5,000 employees, is now taking a stand against domestic violence. And CEO Courtney is out there in front of the camera doing all kinds of press pieces and ads about how great it is, but it's not true. It's not from the heart. It's a media piece. We've seen companies use responding to domestic violence as a media piece, and I will tell you that the people that need you the most see right through that. And the boss needs to stress that this is a commitment. We are here from you. You now work in a safe environment. And as you can see, if you do that and you create that workplace, you are going to get some of the most loyal employees for your company that are going to be lifelong employees. And the team is there to respond to disclosures, respond to incidents, and to figure out, okay, we want to address domestic violence. Let's bring all these team players together to see how in the puzzle everybody fits. Obviously, you need administration, HR as part of your team. They're the ones that are involved with days off. They're also involved with benefits and insurance, which was an issue that came up in Kate's company, is there insurance? And one of the things that I tell some victims, and it's sad that I have to tell them this, But when we're talking about safety planning and future plans, and they're in a very violent or what we call a lethal relationship, one of the things that sadly I have to tell them is, okay, do you have insurance at work? Any type of beneficiaries, life insurance or whatever it might be, who's your beneficiary? Okay, let's get that changed. Let's not have Robbie as your beneficiary anymore, because God forbid Robbie kills me, and maybe there isn't a prosecution. Who's going to benefit financially from my death but Robbie? So those are just some little things that we always think about as we move forward. You also want to have loss prevention or security. How many companies here have your own security company? Not many. 2? Maybe 3. So does that mean you don't have anybody on this as part of security, as part of your team?
Right.
Wrong. What town do you live in? What town does the workplace in?
Northampton, Greenfield, or Orange.
Okay, you now have 3 security departments. They're called 911. Northampton PD, Orange PD. What was the third one?
Greenfield.
Greenfield PD. Your police department wants to work with you. They want to work with you before tragedy strikes as opposed to after tragedy strikes. They are there to assist you with violence that happens at the workplace, restraining order violations. It's better to get to know them beforehand. And I always use this example. God forbid you have an awful tragedy, a shooting at your workplace. I don't know if anybody remembers this big guy with a big beard and crazy hair named Mucko that went to his workplace, I believe it was in Cambridge, and killed a bunch of the employees. The police responded to an active shooting, and they were handicapped because they'd never been to this workplace before. They didn't know the layout, and the reports that came out afterwards, had they only known the layout of that workplace, that lives could have been saved. But there was an active shooter in there, and they didn't know where to go. But you want to get to know your police department. A lot of them have domestic violence officers, sexual assault officers. You want to get to know that person, so if somebody does disclose, you can work with that police department if they choose to call the police, if they choose to get a restraining order, if they choose to, you want some safety issues. A lot of departments we have on after certain incidences, drive by victim's home. You know, Robbie drives a black Suburban license plate E551. If that's in the neighborhood or in the driveway, you know there's a problem in the house. So you have your own built-in security. Yep.
You just said something about if the victim wants to call the police. So that confidentiality question, the victim discloses to the employer. Does that then give the right to the employer at that moment then to disclose to the police? Or at what point does the victim retain control of certain decisions? And at what point does the employer, so maybe at some other
We're going to get to that, but it's a case-by-case basis. And what have they disclosed? What details have they disclosed? Have they disclosed Robbie's threatened to come to the workplace? That's when it gets out of the victim's hand, if your workplace becomes an object. But prior to that, if you know, she's been abused at home, she's looking for help, she doesn't want to report the assault and battery, it's still her option. So it's a very fine line as when does the workplace become a target. But I'm going to, poor Amherst PD, I'm going to pick on you for a minute. But if an employer called and wanted to meet somebody from the Amherst PD to talk to them about domestic violence or restraining orders, what would the Amherst PD say to them?
They would refer them to me.
Perfect. See? So you do have a security person on your team. And I guarantee that most police departments would react in the same positive way and say, yes, what can I do to help you? Because that's part of their function. It's not just responding to calls, but the police department is part of prevention too. So thanks for being put on the spot. I keep doing that to you. I'm sorry. Public relations. A lot of companies forget to bring public relations into the team, but God forbid something does happen at the workplace and you need to have a pre-plan of, if this happens, what is, you know, the corporate line going to be to the press? How are we going to respond? Who will we even talk to? So public relations is a big person to put on the team. Legal department, Anybody here have a legal department? Some do. If you have a legal department. If not, if you choose to create a policy, it's something, a cost that the company is going to have to take on, but in the end, it's going to benefit if you have work with an attorney, and there are many attorneys that specialize in domestic violence that you can, employment law and domestic violence that you can find through the Mass Bar Association. Employee Assistance Program. Who has EAP here? All right, for those of you that don't, once again, you do have EAP. It's called
NELQUIT and Safe Passage.
NELQUIT and Safe Passage, because they are your community advocacy agencies that are there that you should befriend. Because if somebody discloses, the first thing that you want to do is say, I'm not an expert, and I'm going to give you some options. They're the ones that are going to provide the direct services to the victim. Can you just describe to them, if they don't know, what NELQUIT is and Safe Passage is?
Sure. So NELQUIT, New England Learning Center for Women in Transition, and Safe Passage. So they are the programs that work with battered women and their children and families who are experiencing domestic violence and sexual assault. There's also the Center for Women in Community, which is out of UMass. So we're actually really fortunate in this area. We have some great resources, and the pamphlets that you have in your packets, the numbers, they both, all three have 24-hour hotlines that are confidential and free, so any survivor can call that number at any time and get assistance. They have legal advocacy that they provide in the court, so there's a lot of great services that people can access.
And this is actually a good time to fix the disclaimer, correct the disclaimer that I gave, Mary and I both gave earlier, that these programs, and there are also programs, when we're talking about intimate partner violence, we have to remember that our employees in same-sex relationships also are in violent relationships. You know, domestic violence is not stay in a heterosexual relationship. It is with any intimate partner relationship. Also, there's a Network Lared out of Boston, as well as the Gay Men's Alliance. So there are resources. So you need to know all of your resources out there. So you do have an EAP. And we're going to talk a little bit about what they can do for you as if a victim discloses. And then, anyone here have unions? Got to invite the union. When I worked at the sheriff's office, we had a couple of unions and management, and they do what they think is best. This is just for their employees. So sometimes it's important to have them at the table, especially if you're changing or creating policies. It's imperative that they are at the table for that. And back to the EAP assistance, if only Kate had known Safe Passages or the other one, when Yoko called you to see if there was any money or benefits to pay for funeral, Safe Passages would have said, yes, there is. It's called Mass Victim Comp, and those expenses would have been paid. So it's really important. These agencies out there are not just for counseling, but they provide such wraparound services when it comes to counseling, financial support, you know, safe housing, sheltering, helping get money to pay for oil, mortgage, first, last security. How can I keep my phone on? Giving a victim, you know, he's tracking my cell phone, giving somebody a secondary phone to use. So it's more than just counseling what these agencies can do for you, and that's why you need to befriend them just as much as you need to befriend your local domestic violence, local police department. So, and this team that you build is going to provide direction, define roles, defines responsibilities. If something happens, if somebody discloses, this is the team that's actually going to build that base and foundation for you. Then that team, we're going to talk about training, is going to be responsible for training. Whatever decisions are made, those decisions need to be trained from the top to the bottom. And they're the ones that are going to identify these external resources for you. You know, when Safe Passages comes to the table, they're going to be able to tell you about other resources that are in the community. When the police department comes, they're going to be able to provide you with other resources in the community that you as an employer don't know anything about, and you wouldn't know unless you created a partnership with these companies. And this team does not need to go looking for its first case. It will come to you if the team the boss creates the environment where one wants to disclose. So we talk about you know, policy. Only 1 or 2 companies here has a policy, and you have to think about, do you want to create a policy? And if you can't create a policy, you still need to think the things through that we're talking about. Because even if you don't have a policy, 1 in 4 females are victims of domestic violence. You have employees that are victims of domestic violence. So even if you can't or don't create a policy, you have to think about it and you have to respond in some way. A lot of companies, their legal department advises them, don't create a policy, because if you create that policy, you are stuck with it, and there's legal liability. And I always shake my head. Everybody wants to talk about the legal liability of creating a policy, but a policy creates the basis and foundation so people know how to act, how to react to this. It's a friend, not a foe. And that policy will decide and will dictate, okay, somebody comes forward, what team members do we activate? Because the biggest key to responding to domestic violence in your workplace and actually having victims disclose is your policy, and your response has to be dictated by confidentiality. What that person discloses to that manager, co-worker, who then discloses to a manager, has to be kept confidential within the team. And not everybody in the team needs to know the disclosure. You need to decide when people get to know. Does a manager really need to know why Courtney's not at work today? No. Only the HR person needs to know. Courtney's taking a day today. That's not going to be counted against her sick or vacation time. Nobody else needs to know why Courtney's taking a day off. This policy, you need to decide, are you going to give people additional time off besides vacation and sick leave? Is that additional time going to be paid or unpaid? Can we afford to give our employees that have to take time off for court or doctor's appointments or therapists, can we afford to pay them for those days additionally? It's going to dictate training. And I think what the team is a really good thing to do. It started because a male went to a university in Canada and specifically targeted women and killed all the women that were in his sight. And at that point, men in the area said, we have a responsibility to respond to violence against women. Most domestic violence things you go to, it is filled with women and hardly any of men. And this is a campaign allowing men to take a stand and men to speak out. So do a white ribbon campaign event. You can actually just Google white ribbon campaign. You can find everything you could possibly need. So do education, but also do fun things that engage your employees to make them feel like they are making a difference and they are helping create the environment, the positive environment for disclosure. Here we go. Nobody wants to talk about this one. Legal liability. If it's the only thing to get your CEO to buy into this responding to domestic violence, there is a legal liability to respond to domestic violence. In lawsuits involving employers and victims of domestic violence, when there's been some type of workplace issue, the average suit costs the employer $2.2 million. Just take that back to work today. Hey, I'm going to save you an average of $2.2 million just by doing this. OSHA. We'll start with OSHA because we think of OSHA with a really big oil spill, but OSHA just isn't for oil spills. This is where we get to your question about when do I call the police? You have an obligation to maintain a workplace free from recognized hazards. Courtney comes to work and discloses, Robbie has been abusing me for years. And he's always told me that if he can't find me, he always knows that I'm going to be at work, and I will come kill you at work. You now have an obligation, whether Courtney wants you to or not, to react to that. Because now, okay, might say, well, Courtney, you know what? We're going to have you stay at home for the next month and pay you. And you think that that might take away the recognized hazard. But Robbie doesn't know where Courtney lives, and Robbie's still going to storm into that workplace looking for her and may injure or kill other coworkers of Courtney's. So you have to react to the recognized hazards. And what could be seen in the foreseeable future. If you fail to, you could be held liable. Think about an existing restraining order. You know, you have a duty not only to protect Courtney, but your other coworkers if there's a threat that Robbie is going to violate that restraining order and do something at the workplace. If you, as an employer, if she discloses, you know, he sits outside all the time, he's always watching me come and go, he sees me leave, he sees me come every day, you have an obligation to maintain a workplace free from violence for all of your others. And that's where it gets tricky. That gets to, okay, how do we tell Courtney that we tried to keep this confidential, but now we're going to call the Amherst Police Department, we are going to talk to management, and we're actually going to move you to a different location. But I guarantee if you explain to that employer that's disclosed that now that you've told this to us, we're going to do everything we can to help you. But we also can't keep it confidential between you and me because your coworkers are at risk. I guarantee you every victim wants their coworkers to be safe and will give you the permission to properly disclose to who you think you need to keep it keep the workplace safe for other coworkers. I talked to you a little bit about other laws besides our big OSHA one. This doesn't apply to liability. It sort of does, because if a victim quits her job because of the domestic violence, or you fire her because of domestic violence, I know if you quit, you can't apply for unemployment. But it's important for you all to know, if you're in charge of the one working with the unemployment benefits, that in Massachusetts, our law currently stands, changed 5 or 6 years ago maybe, that if you are a victim of domestic violence and you voluntarily leave work or are fired because of domestic violence, you actually can claim unemployment insurance benefits. So that's important for everybody to know. You have to think of federal and state anti-discrimination laws. Are you firing somebody because of domestic violence, and is that masking or actually getting into sexual harassment, sexual discrimination because she's a female and a victim of domestic violence? There's actually been federal cases regarding that. Somebody can claim the FMLA Act. Who's an HR person? When can somebody claim for FMLA?
Serious health condition for the individual.
Mm-hmm. And you might have somebody that comes to you that wants to claim FMLA because they have a serious condition from domestic violence. They have. Many victims of domestic violence suffer from repeated trauma, and they have PTSD. So you need to think about FMLA is actually a good way to assist your victims of domestic violence. And then I want to talk to you about a case. It was a Massachusetts case. It was called Asbestos, is that how I say it, versus Memorial Press. It was actually a Plymouth case, and this victim had disclosed to her employer that she was a victim of domestic violence prior to an incident. She was home on a Saturday. Defendant broke into her house, injured her. The defendant was arrested. She got an emergency restraining order. I'm going to go over restraining orders in a little bit, but the restraining order was only good till Monday morning. So to protect herself and extend her restraining order, she had to go to Plymouth District Court and try and extend that restraining order. So she called her manager and said, hey, Robbie was arrested for assaulting me Saturday night. He's in custody of the Plymouth Police Department. I have to go to court on Monday morning to extend my restraining order, so I'm not going to be at work. She then came to court, got a restraining order. She actually went back with the Plymouth PD. They actually helped her change her locks, so she thought she could get there by noon, but court took longer. Then she needed to change her locks, and the police department wanted to take additional photos of her injuries. And so she went to work on Tuesday morning, and what do you think happened? She got fired because she called in and took a day that she, under whatever policies or they had regarding taking sick or vacation time, she didn't follow it. She just called in, and this wasn't one of their legitimate reasons. So she filed suit, and she won. Cost them millions of dollars, and part of the suit was anti-discrimination. They violated anti-discrimination laws, but the biggest one was wrongful discharge in violation of public policy. Because what the court said is public policy in Massachusetts is that you have a legal right to protect yourself, and you can take steps to protect yourself. And if you are a victim of domestic violence and you are exercising your legal right to protect yourself, i.e., getting a restraining order, you can't be disciplined at work for trying to protect yourself, execute that public policy. So they actually ruled against the employer for discharging her, saying it was a violation of public policy. So think about that case as you move forward, as you talk to your CEOs and any legal assistance that you have. I just want to talk about some policies for a minute. You have in your handouts, you have some best practices from EADV, you have a model policy, but you also have the state policy. And we learned a lot of lessons. I think the first state policy came out with Governor Cellucci, and every governor since has continued this policy. Any employee of the executive department, executive branch of the state of Massachusetts falls under this policy. And as you can see, it gives additional days off, unpaid leave, people's responsibilities, and if you are an abuser, it can, this one doesn't, but I think one in there provides for progressive discipline of abusers. And what this taught Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts, is that it really needs to come from the top, and that's why it came from the governor. It didn't come from a commissioner of Health and Human Services, didn't come from commissioner, secretary of EOPS, or secretary of DPH. It actually came from the governor, because it has to come from the top. As you read it, it's very clear in its definitions who can access this policy, and it's not limited to just victims of domestic violence. It's victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and if their child is a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. It establishes a team in that policy, creates training, and what it really does is it minimizes surprises. If somebody discloses, it's all wrapped up in as tight a nice bow as you can possibly get. That time off, as I said, victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, they need time off. We actually looked at a case as part of a presentation with EADV a few weeks ago, and the victim had a parallel criminal case, but had children and was going through probate court. And in an 11-month period, we tracked her court dates. She had court dates 21 times. In 11 months. She doesn't have to go to all of the criminal case court dates, but there's an option to go. She has to go to all of her probate court dates. So 21 times court dates in an 11-month period. They need time off. So when you're dealing with somebody and they keep asking for time off, even if it's unpaid, they need it because they have to address these issues. They also needed to go to counseling, bring their children to counseling, bring their children to therapy. A lot of the advocacy agencies actually have groups for children who witness domestic violence, and I encourage you to encourage your employees, if they do have victims, to take advantage of that. Right now, who here, I should know, but who here has a workplace with 50 or more employees? If a bill gets signed into law in the next month, which I am assuming it is going to, because it's been about 5 years since we've been trying to pass most of this, you are going to have to, the state is mandating you to create a policy. That legislation, did I give you the legislation or not?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so, yeah.
Okay, that legislation is going to mandate you to create a policy. And when you say 50 or more employees, if nobody raised their hand, it actually covers vendors and contractors. If your vendors and contractors that you use go over 50, it's going to cover that. It covers family members. The family members include anyone married, dating, live together, child in common, parent, step-parent, child, sibling, grandparent, grandchild, guardians. They are included as somebody that can take advantage of this policy. It does require documentation and notice, and when you read it you can see that no notice needs to be given if it's an immediate threat, but to access this policy, if it's appropriate, if there's appropriate time, your employee would have to give you advance notice that they have a court date, that they have a therapy session, or they have to get to probate court. But there are times when a victim, like in the Memorial Press, she didn't have advance notice. She didn't know she was going to be abused on Saturday night and needed to get an emergency restraining order on Monday. So it allows for somebody not giving you notice, but they're also going to have to provide documentation that they are a victim, but it's a very broad definition. They can supply a police report, but they don't have to supply a police report. A notice from therapist, clergy member, social worker that they're working with. They themselves can do a sworn statement, or they can give you a restraining order. So, and it also states that the file, when this person gives you the documentation, it goes in the employee's file only until the determination is made that the day off requested was okay. After that, we go back to that confidentiality. It gets taken out of the file and shredded, because in 5 years, that shouldn't be public knowledge for a new HR member, whoever is coming in and looking at personnel files. It gets taken out because of that confidentiality. Does anyone have any questions on that piece of legislation? Get ready. We're going to move into, okay, I think one of my coworkers may be experiencing DV. Now what do I do? Oh goodness, that 40 minutes flew. How about we, change, you come in at 8 instead of 9, leave at 2 instead of 3. There are many places in this room that have multiple locations. Would you be safer if you changed location? Talk to the police. Do you want us to call the police, see if we can arrange for some checks by yourself? By your house. Okay, where are the kids? Let's review safety of child care safety. As an employer, remove, if it's one of those disclosures that he calls all the time, he keeps looking for me. If you have one of those automated answering, phone answering, and it's got that directory, press 3 and dial who you're calling, the first 3 letters of their last name. Take that employee out of there. If you have a live person answering the phone, take out that extension for any referrals, any calls being forwarded to there. If the defendant is coming to the workplace and being, I guess no other way to say it, a nuisance, victim doesn't feel safe getting a restraining order to keep the defendant off of the workplace, but he's become, his behavior has become harassing and annoying to the workplace. If there are 3 or more incidents of him coming, hasn't been done in Massachusetts, but I encourage employers to try this. Go to the courthouse and get what's called a harassment prevention order. He is harassing your workplace. You want him to stay away. If the victim can't get the restraining order, at least you can prevent him from going to the workplace. Change up. Where does that victim park? Can we change up where she parks to a different area, a better lit area? Do we have security? Do we have somebody that can escort her in and out of the workplace every day? If the victim does get a restraining order, make sure the person at the front desk and anybody else that might be on the perimeter, outside perimeter, has a photo. Victim might not want to give it up at first, but if you say, hey, I need to share this restraining order so that if he comes to this workplace, we can call 911, get a photo of the abuser and share it with those that might meet him first. It's very important, too, on a restraining order, if the workplace is named in the restraining order, 32 Belmont Street, Brockton. If it's named there, even if I'm not at 32 Belmont Street, Robbie shows up at 32 Belmont Street, it's a violation of restraining order. Call the Amherst PD or whatever your local police department is.
On the restraining order, and in that situation, so there's no line of confidentiality that we need to worry about?
If she brings a restraining order to your attention, that's when you have that conversation with her. There's no confidentiality laws that say you can't talk up to anybody about a restraining order, but out of professional respect and personal respect, tell her you need to share this with, Joe at the security desk, Rita at the reception desk, and explain who you're going to share it with. And then when you share it with these people, make sure they know this isn't water cooler conversation. And nobody needs to know the reason why she got a restraining order. She got a restraining order, and that's where the conversation stops. We're not going to guess or speculate what happened to bring her to this.
The harassment prevention order, how is that enforced?
The harassment prevention order is enforced just as a restraining order. It prevents somebody from having contact, stay away from certain places. So if somebody violates it by coming to the workplace, it's the same as a restraining order. Carries a penalty up to 2.5 years in the House of Correction. These are top mistakes. It's in your handouts. But remember, I just want to close with saying you are not the expert. Rely on your experts, which are the advocacy agencies, the police departments. Make sure confidentiality is your biggest key to responding to domestic violence in the workplace. Don't advise, don't judge, just offer options. And make sure you properly train, because if you don't properly train, it's not going to work. Thanks.